Over the last few weeks, we've been talking about some basics to make your PC experience a lot more user-friendly, so to speak. Now we're going to start diving into some computer hardware, so stay tuned. When it comes to computer hardware, the first place that we always need to start with is the motherboard. Now what a motherboard is a PCB, or printed circuit board, that allows all the other components to plug into it so everything knows what to do. Without this motherboard, your processor, video card, storage, and even your RAM would have no idea what to do or even when to do it. So we're going to go over some of the more important connections on motherboards. So the first thing that we're going to talk about in regards to motherboards is going to be the CPU socket. Now there's two types of mainstream sockets that we're going to go over today. The first one is actually used by Intel Corporation, and that is going to be the Land Grid Array, or LGA socket. Now what this means is in the socket on the motherboard, there's going to be a bunch of little pins inside of there. They're very fragile, so if you ever use one of those, you have to be very careful. Now on the underside of the CPU, the processor, are going to be little gold contact pads. These pads sit on top of the pins, and wherever they connect is a different signal for the CPU to give whatever. Now, the second type of mainstream socket is going to be from AMD, and that is going to be the Pin Grid Array, or PGA. Now, what this means is that the socket itself is where the contact points are. They're actually inside. If you look right here, you'll see little holes where the socket are. Now, on the underside of AMD's latest Ryzen processors, and even some of their older FX and Phenoms, anyway, on the underside of AMD's processors are the actual little pins. Those pins will slot into the little hole, and they'll make contact, and that is how it tells everything what to do. So everything's reversed as far as Intel and AMD. Basically, with AMD, the motherboard is safer, it's not as fragile, it's the pins on the CPU that you need to watch out for. Vice versa with Intel. Intel, you need to be very careful with the motherboard socket. The CPU is less fragile. The next point that we're going to talk about today is going to be the RAM slots. Now that's what these little things are right here. Basically, your RAM stick, RAM stands for random access memory. This is what allows the computer basically to start loading things in the background quickly, so that way you're not waiting forever for a slower hard drive, or even an SSD is slower than what your system memory is capable of. So these slots are actually keyed. What that means is that there's only one way to install a RAM stick. So you'll never be able to install it backwards or anything like that. There's one way to go in, snap, you're good to go. Next up, we're going to talk about different interfaces for hard drives. The most common one that's been around for quite a long time is the SATA interface. Now, basically what that is a little cable that goes into the motherboard on one side, snakes through, and then plugs into either SSD, 2.5 inch, or your hard drive, whether it's a 2.5 inch laptop drive or a 3.5 inch desktop drive. Either way, most of the time, the majority of drives that you see are going to utilize SATA. Now, more recently, there is another motherboard connection that actually links directly into another system bus that we're about to go over. But what it does is it allows these little gumstick-sized drives to slot directly onto the motherboard, so there's no cables for power, no cables for communication, or anything like that. So if you want a cleaner looking system, I recommend going M.2. I don't want to fry your brain or anything, so there's just one last thing that we're going to go over, and that's this little slot right here. What that is the Pci Express Slot. What this is going to slot in most commonly is going to be your graphics card. Other than a graphics card, it can be your network interface card or your NIC. It can be a capture card if you're streaming video or recording something onto your computer. Basically, any other peripheral that's not your RAM, your CPU, or a hard drive. There's a couple of exceptions to that last one, but for the most part, it's your graphics cards or network interface cards that slot into these PCI Express slots. Now, that PCI Express bus will travel from the slot basically through the different layers of the motherboard to the processor for communication. Now, the nice thing is remember that M.2 slot that we were talking about? most of those M.2s, especially if it says Ultra or Hyper, then what it means is that it connects directly to the PCI Express bus. So you're getting much faster read and writes to your disk as opposed to older SATA communication. Again, I don't want to fry your brain this week, guys, so that's going to be it for today. Go ahead and toss me another like if you got some value out of this video. If not, you sure know what to do. Down in the description below, there's going to be some links to several different motherboards that I recommend, both for AMD and Intel. That way, if you need one or you're wanting to look a bit more into this, you'll know exactly where to start looking. But again, go ahead and toss me a like, toss me a dislike, comment down below if you have any questions, concerns, or anything like that, and we'll catch you again next week for another piece of hardware.